Folks call me Earl McKenna. I've spent more years on the water than some folks spend on God's green earth, and my face has got the charts to prove it. Every line is a storm survived, every crease a long watch under the moon. You sit with a man long enough, you learn his stories without him saying a word. But some stories, you gotta tell. They sit heavy in your chest like an anchor you can't quite pull up. This is one of those. It's about a day the sea decided to whisper one of its secrets, and I was the only one around to listen. It started on a morning that didn't feel real. The sea, usually so full of its own opinions, choppy and angry one day, rolling and content the next, was dead still. I mean, unnaturally. It was like a great sheet of pewter, gray, heavy, reflecting a sky that was the same washed-out color. There was no line where the water met the air. It all just blended. I was out on my boat, the Sea Swallow, a vessel as old and stubborn as I am, her diesel engine chugging along with a rhythm I knew better than my own heartbeat. My only company was Buddy, my old dog. He was a mix of something sturdy and something loyal, with a coat the color of dried seaweed and eyes that held the same deep, knowing quiet as the ocean itself. Usually, he'd be up at the ball, nose twitching, reading the wind like it was the morning paper. But not that day. He was pressed against my leg, shivering, with a low whine caught deep in his throat. I reached down and scratched behind his ears, the fur coarse under my calloused fingers. "Easy, boy," I murmured, my voice sounding too loud, oppressive. "Just a calm day. Good for the bones." But Buddy knew better. Animals always do. They feel the world in a way we've forgotten, a vibration in the earth, a change in the air pressure that whispered of things to come. His unease was a small, sharp stone in the pit of my stomach. That's when the fog rolled in. It didn't drift. It descended. It came down like a thick, wet blanket, smothering the world in an instant. One moment, I could see the faint, smudged suggestion of the distant shore. The next, there was nothing but a wall of white in every direction. The sound of the engine seemed to get swallowed, muffled close. The sharp tang of salt was replaced by a damp, earthy smell, like a cellar that hadn't been opened in a century. We were in our own little world, the Sea Swallow, me, and the dog, a ghost ship on a ghost sea. I wasn't scared, not then. Fog is just weather. You learn to trust your compass and your gut. I throttled back the engine, letting our momentum carry us, planning to just wait it out. It was then, in that near-complete silence, broken only by the gentle thump-thump of the idling engine and the soft lap of water against the hull, it happened. There was no crash, no sharp crack of timber. It was a dull, heavy thud that I felt more than heard, a sickening lurch that came up from the keel, through the deck, and right into the soles of my boots. The Sea Swallow stopped dead. Not a gradual slowing, but a full stop, as if a giant hand had reached up from the deep and grabbed her. Buddy let out a sharp yelp and scrambled behind me, his claws scrabbling on the worn deck. I stumbled, catching myself on the cabin wall. My first thought was a sandbar. It happens. The currents are always shifting the seabed, building up new traps for the unwary. Annoying, but not the end of the world. Well, damn it all, I grumbled, more to myself than to the dog. I pushed the throttle into reverse. The engine screamed in protest, the propeller churning the still water into a muddy froth. The boat groaned, every plank and screw straining, but we didn't move an inch. It was like trying to push a mountain. I cut the engine, and the silence that rushed back in was heavier than before. This wasn't a sandbar. I've run aground on sandbars. There's a gritty, scraping feel to it, a kind of grudging give. This was different. This was solid, immovable. My next thought was a log, a big one, a whole tree maybe, washed out from the river mouth in the last storm, waterlogged and lurking just below the surface. A submerged deadhead, we call them. They're dangerous, but this felt bigger. The sheer inertia of it was wrong. When you hit a log, there's usually some roll, some slight shift as the object moves under the weight of the boat. This thing, whatever it was, didn't give a fraction of an inch. It was as if the sea swallow had become part of the geology of the ocean floor. I walked the length of my small deck, peering over the side. The fog was so thick, it was like trying to look into a bowl of milk. The water was murky, dark. I could see nothing below the surface but my own distorted reflection. I stomped on the deck, first at the bow, then at the stern. The sound, flat, dead thud, no vibration, no echo. The boat felt grounded, pinned. A chill, entirely separate from the damp air, crawled up my spine. Buddy seemed to feel it too. His whining had stopped, replaced by a low guttural growl that vibrated through the deck. His hackles were up, and his gaze was fixed on the water off the port side. This was the part that started to gnaw at me. The silence, the isolation. A simple problem like being stuck felt magnified by the eerie stillness, by the white blindness of the fog. Out here, you're always aware that you're a tiny speck in something vast, powerful. But on that day, it felt like the vastness had taken a personal interest in me. My mind started to play tricks. Every creak of the cooling engine, every drip of condensation in the rigging sounded like a footstep, a breath. Frustration began to curdle into a real, cold unease. I'd been in storms that could tear a boat in two, faced waves the size of houses, but this quiet, unmoving obstacle felt more menacing than any gale. It was the unknown of it. A storm you can see, you can fight it. But this was a quiet, patient thing that had simply decided I wasn't going anywhere. After what felt like an hour of just standing there, listening to the sound of my own breathing, I knew I had to do something. Waiting for the fog to lift, the tide to change, felt like surrendering. I am not a man who surrenders, least of all to a damn piece of wood. My jaw set. I'd been gentle. I'd tried to coax her free. Now, it was time for some persuasion. I went to my toolbox and pulled out the long boat hook, a sturdy pole of ash wood with a heavy brass hook and spike at the end. It was an extension of my own arm, used for fending off docks, snagging lines, and prodding things I didn't want to touch. It felt heavy and solid in my hands, a familiar comfort against the rising strangeness of the situation. I would find the edge of this log, get some leverage, and push us off. It was a simple, practical plan. It was the plan of a fisherman. I walked to the port side, to the spot where Buddy was still staring, his body rigid with a tension I'd never seen in him before. "All right, you stubborn son of a," I muttered, leaning over the rail. I plunged the end of the boat hook into the dark water, probing for the thing that held us captive. I expected the hard, rough feel of waterlogged bark. I expected the solid knock of wood. What I felt instead made the breath catch in my throat. It wasn't wood. The moment the brass tip of the hook made contact, I knew. There was no hard, unyielding clack of metal on timber, no scraping sound of bark. Instead, there was a soft, dull thump and a give, a slight, fleshy give, like pressing a finger into a side of beef. The pole vibrated in my hands, not with a jarring shock, but with a deep, low resonance, as if I'd struck the string of some colossal underwater instrument. I pushed again, harder. The surface I was prodding was firm, pliant, and it was slick, not the slimy slickness of algae on a rock, but the smooth, oiled slickness of a living hide. I froze, the boat hook held tight in my fists. My mind, a fisherman's mind, raced through the possibilities, discarding them as fast. A whale? No. I've seen whales up close, nudged them away from my lines. Their skin is different, rubbery and often scarred with barnacles. This was smoother. Sunken submarine? Ridiculous. The hull would be cold, hard steel, not this. Felt organic, ancient. Buddy's growl deepened into a frantic, desperate barking. It wasn't his stranger on the docks bark or his seagull trying to steal the bait bark. This was a sound I had never heard come from him, a raw, high-pitched noise of pure primal terror. He backed away, scrabbling at the cabin door, his eyes wide and wild, fixed on the patch of water I was prodding. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic drum against the silent sailor's instinct in me, the one honed by 50 years of storms and strange tides, screaming. It screamed, wrong, 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 but the man in me, stubborn, curious fool who had to know, couldn't pull away. I had to understand what held me captive. Slowly, deliberately, I let the boat hook slide from my grip. It clattered onto the deck, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Buddy flinched. I knelt down, my old knees protested, and reached over my fingers trembled as I lowered them toward the water surface. I hesitated for only a second, then plunged my hand in. The water was shockingly cold, but what I touched was not. It was warm, a deep, living warmth, like that of a great horse after a long run. My fingertips brushed against a surface that felt like ancient, toughened leather, stretched taut over something of immense power. There were no scales, but a network of fine grooved creases, palm of a giant's hand, the bark petra tree. It was impossibly vast. I moved my hand left, then right, and found no edge, no end to it. My little boat was resting on the back of a living thing. I snatched my hand back as if I'd touched a hot stove, a gasp escaping my lips. The water dripped from my fingers onto the deck, each drop landing like a hammer blow in the silence. It wasn't a log, it wasn't a rock, it was alive, and it knew I was there. As if in response to my touch, tremor ran through it. It wasn't a violent shake, slow, profound ripple of muscle, a deep, deliberate movement that made the sea swallow rock gently, a cradle in the back of a god. The water around the boat began to swirl, not from a current, but as if displaced, slow, immense inhalation. I was paralyzed, half by fear, half terrible, soul-shaking awe. What beast could be so large? What creature the sea hidden in its dark pocket, far from the eyes of men? The old tales, the sailors' yarns about krakens and sea serpents that we'd tell over whiskey, laughing them off as drunken fantasy. They weren't stories, they were warnings. I scrambled back to my feet and leaned far over the rail, my eyes straining to pierce the murky depths. I needed to see. I had to see. Buddy was now utterly silent, cowering behind me, his body pressed so hard against my legs I could feel him trembling. The surface of the water directly beside the boat began to bulge upwards. It rose slowly without a splash, a great, dark mound of wrinkled hide breaking the surface. It was the size of a small car. The fog swirled around it, making the shape indistinct. A piece of the deep ocean floor come to life, and then the mound shifted. A deep crease, a furrow in the leathery skin began to open. It was like watching a mountain fold in on itself. It was not a crease, it was an eyelid. It opened slowly, a colossal leathery curtain drawing back the stage of the abyss, and beneath it the eye. My breath hitched in my throat, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. It was the size of a dinner plate, a perfect, luminous circle, the dark flesh. The iris was a brilliant, impossible yellow, shot through with veins of gold and amber, like a sun trapped in ancient rock. And in the center of that burning sun was the pupil, a long vertical slit of absolute black, a doorway into the crushing, eternal night of the deep. It wasn't looking at the boat. It was looking at me. There was no malice in that gaze, no hunger. There was something far more intelligent. A vast, ancient, and utterly alien consciousness looked out from that eye, and in its depths I saw the weight of eons. I saw the crushing pressure of the abyssal plains, the slow drift of continents, the birth and death of stars, reflected in a consciousness that measured time in tides and ice ages. My 50 years on the water, my storms, my triumphs, my entire existence, it all shriveled to nothing under that gaze. I was a mayfly, a fleeting speck of dust that had landed on a being whose thoughts were as slow and powerful as tectonic plates. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my gut, but it was drowned in a wave of profound, humbling awe. I was no longer a fisherman on his boat. I was an intruder, a witness to something man was never meant to. The creature, this titan, was simply looking, waiting. Time didn't just stop, ceased to exist. The universe shrank to the few feet of open water between the rail of the swallow and that single colossal eye. My own heartbeat, which had been a frantic drum against my ribs, slowed to a deep, heavy tolling, each beat marking a century. The eye did not blink, it simply watched, and in its watching, it held me, pinned me more surely than it had pinned my boat. This was not the gaze of a predator sizing up its prey. There was no hunger there, no cold calculation. It was something far more profound. It was the look of a mountain contemplating a cloud, the look of a tide examining a grain of sand. In that moment, I understood what it was, truly, utterly insignificant. My life, with all its joys and sorrows, all its hard-won knowledge of the sea, was a single, meaningless word in a library of epic, written in a language of pressure and time. The fear, that cold, sharp thing that had gripped me, began to melt away, replaced by a feeling so vast and overwhelming I had no name for. It was a kind of sacred terror, a humility that hollowed me out from the inside. Who was I to feel fear? Who was I to feel anything at all in the presence of this? I was a creature of the surface, of sunlight and air, and I had stumbled upon a secret of the deep, dark, silent world, a secret that wasn't meant for me. My hands, which were gripping the rail so my knuckles were white, slowly I thought of the boat hook lying on the deck. I thought of the flare gun in the cabin. What were they? Children's toys. Insults. A man does not raise a fist to a hurricane. He does not threaten an earthquake. He simply bears witness. Slowly, as if my arms were filled with lead, I let go of the rail. I took a half step back and raised my empty hands, palms forward. It wasn't a gesture of surrender. You cannot surrender to something that is not your enemy. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, a sign. I see you. I mean no harm. I am nothing. Buddy, who had been a trembling heap at my feet, seemed to understand. His low growl subsided into a quiet whimper. He trusted, and my calm, however fragile, was flowing into him. For a long moment, nothing changed. The great yellow eye continued its ancient appraisal. Then, for the first time, it moved. The massive eyelid, a fold of living geography, began to lower. It descended with slowness, a final, deliberate curtain call on our encounter. It closed. The moment the eye was hidden, a deep, resonant groan echoed up from the abyss, a sound that vibrated through the hull of my boat and into the marrow of my bones. It was the sound of a continent, of a glacier calving into the sea. The water around us began to boil, not with violence, the immense purpose placement leaving the back of the creature, the island that began to sink. The sea swallow pitched forward into the resultant trough, water sloshing over the bow. I grabbed the rail to steady myself, watching, mesmerized, as the patch of dark, wrinkled hide slid beneath the waves. There was a final great swirl as a fluke or a fin the size of my entire boat disturbed the surface, and then it was gone. The sea was empty. The boat free. I stood there for a long time, my hand still held loosely in the air, staring at the spot where it had been. The sea swallow rocked gently, swells. The only sounds were the drip of water from the scuppers and the soft panting of my dog, who had finally crept forward to press his head against my hand. Then, as if a spell had been broken, I noticed the fog. It was thinning. Patches of gray sky were visible above, and I could see the water for more than a few feet around the boat. The world was returning. Peace, peace. The oppressive silence was being replaced by the familiar sounds of the sea, the cry of a distant gull, the gentle slap of waves against the hull. I didn't start the engine. Not yet. I sat down on the bait box, my legs suddenly weak. I ran a trembling hand over Buddy's head, feeling the solid, reassuring warmth of him. I had been touched by something outside of my world, outside of any world I had ever imagined. I had looked into the eye of the deep, and the deep had looked back. When I finally did turn, the familiar roar of the diesel engine felt like a comforting lie, a pretense that this was just another day, that the world was still the small, understandable place it had been at dawn. But I knew better. As I steered the Sea Swallow toward the now visible shoreline, I felt like a stranger in my own life. The other boats in the harbor, the familiar shape of the docks, the men mending their nets, it all seemed like a stage play, a fragile construction built over an abyss of terrifying and wondrous mystery. I never told anyone not the whole story. I told the boys at the tavern I'd run aground on an unmapped reef and had to wait for the tide. They slapped me on the back, bought me a beer, and told their own stories of close call. I listened and nodded, but my mind was elsewhere. It was out in the fog, on a dead calm sea, staring into a yellow-eyed sun. I'm an old man now, and that day, a long way behind. But sometimes, a quiet night, the tide is high and the moon is hidden. I look out. We sail on the surface we can truly understand. We are just through. And if you've got a taste for stories from an old man who's seen a thing or two, you'd do well to stick around. There's more where that came from. The true vastness of the world is not in its size, but in its secret. Humility is the only proper response when nature reminds you that humanity is not but merely a guest on its ancient shore. You won't want to miss the stories I have to share. Make sure to subscribe and hit that bell so you're notified when I post the next one.